I am so thrilled to be here. Look at all the people who want to hear about entropy. That's crazy. This is my first trip in 18 months. First time back on an airplane. Woo! I was so excited when I heard that it was in person only. I was like, yes, this is fantastic. I forgot how much I like, you know, I don't miss the traveling, but it's nice sometimes to have the bed to yourself, you know, without the dogs and, you know, just like your own time, and yeah, it's great. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here. The thing I miss the most about not traveling for so long is the, you know, meeting one-on-one with people and meeting new people. I think I must have met more new people today than I have in a really long time. Because of just being here, and so I'm really appreciative of everyone's time who met with me today and for your time now. So yes, I want to talk about entropy, and we're going to talk a lot about bonding. I'm going to try to convince you that sometimes it could be useful to think about entropy in the context of an actual entropic bond, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So, oh, I have to turn this on. I'm out of practice. I couldn't even remember how to pack, right? You know, where you like, okay. Anyway, nope, that's on it. That's it. Nope, I'm gonna get there. There it is. Okay, cool. So let's talk about bonding for a little bit. So the first notion of bonding was actually proposed by Isaac Newton back in 1704. He didn't use the word bond, of course, but he said something like, and I'm paraphrasing there, that if matter stays together, there must be some kind of attractive force or something holding it together. From that, I think he inferred there's a presence of what we think about today as a bond. And of course, chemical bonds are among the most fundamental concepts of all of science. And you know, we learn about them in kindergarten. And we understand that physical matter is held together by chemical bonds, whether it's you know, ionic bonding, covalent bonding, hydrogen bonding, metallic bonding, or all the other kinds of bonds. You know, chemical bonds resulting from the sharing or exchange of electrons between atoms is what holds everything together. And it can be explained by quantum theory and, of course, the wave-like nature of the electron. But to really understand what kinds of states of matter are preferred based on chemical bonds, we combine quantum theory with thermodynamics, right? We take quantum theory that describes our interatomic interactions, and we combine it with thermodynamics, which governs free energy minimization, and that determines all the possible structures, in particular crystal structures in nature. So if we know all the atomic forces about a system, and we can minimize the free energy of the system subject to whatever are the constraints on the system, then in principle we can predict all kinds of stable all of the stable crystal structures. And some crystal structures are very complicated, some atomic crystal structures. And here's just a few of them that show how quantum mechanics and thermodynamics can conspire to give this rather extraordinary complexity with arrangements of atoms that can be hierarchical, they can be big cages like in clathrates, you can have huge unit cells. I mean, some of these unit cells have, you know, this, sorry, I'm pointing back there, have like, you know, 52 particles in the unit cell, right? 54 particles in the unit, I should say atoms in the unit cell, 30 atoms in the unit. These are very large unit cells that somehow the system, these materials may start, say, as a liquid. These atoms figure out how to rearrange into these very complicated crystal phases by, you know, through chemical bonding. And even with intermetallics, where you mix together multiple metal alloys, multiple elements of metallic elements, you could get huge unit cells with thousands of atoms in the unit cell. And I think that's extraordinary to think about how the system figures that out. Now, in my group, we don't really study that problem, but we study nanoparticle self-assembly, right? We're interested in making new materials in new ways, and in particular, making new materials by starting with building blocks that are larger than atoms or individual molecules, but are nanoparticles. That can be anywhere from a nanometer to a couple of microns in size. And this is just a scale bar to give you a sense of where that is on this axis, sorry. As long as we're in this range of a nanometer to a couple thousand nanometers, then nanoparticles in a solution that could be water or some organic solution or like toluene or something like that, whatever's appropriate for that particular particle, the particles will exhibit Brownian motion. And if they can exhibit Brownian motion, that means that they can all, in principle, the system can access all the different possible microstates of the system, all of the different possible ways that the particles can organize themselves and orient themselves relative to one another. And so we can study what happens to these nanoparticles when they're in, say, suspended in water, and when the interactions are such that they don't want to stay disordered, but they want to order into some sort of ordered arrangement. And one of the things they can do is form crystals. We call them colloidal crystals because they're made of colloidal particles or nanoparticles. And so just to give you an example, this is an example from Chad Merkin's group. Chad's group has a small industry of people working on taking DNA and attaching DNA to nanoparticles, gold nanoparticles typically, and by making the DNA self-complementary or having two types of particles and making those DNA different but complementary to each other, he could get the particles to self-assemble into structures they would never want to self-assemble into on their own. And so here's an example of colloidal crystals that they make of gold nanoparticles through the bonding of DNA. And if each one of these little tiny dots is a gold nanoparticle. If you were to blow this up, you'd see that these nanoparticles are arranged in a face-centered cubic arrangement. And if you were to blow up each of the nanoparticles, you would see that inside are gold atoms that are also arranged in a face-centered cubic crystal structure. So you have this really cool hierarchy of organization. Of course, the nanoparticles could be any kind of crystal structure relative to whatever crystal structure this is. But that's a very interesting thing because then you can achieve different properties on different scales by controlling the organization of, say, atoms within the nanoparticle and then controlling the organization of the nanoparticles into some larger scale structure. This is the most complex crystal, colloidal crystal, that I'm aware of that's been made so far. It also comes out of Chad Merkin's lab. Here, each one of these little bright spots is a nanoparticle. These are what the nanoparticles look like. This is a 250 nanometer scale bar. And again, they're gold. And it's hard to see from this picture, but if you were to take a tetrahedron and then glue it to another tetrahedron so it's aligned and then squash it, that's what these are. That's the shape of these particles. And these particles are, again, functionalized with self-complementary DNA. And the only real difference between this and the last one is that these nanoparticles aren't spheres. They have a shape to them. And because they have a shape, they self-assemble into something more complex than FCC. And it turns out that they form this clathrate crystal structure with 123 particles in the unit cell. And so the reason why this was exciting is because it was really the first demonstration experimentally that you could really start to access crystal structures that are as complex as what we see it on the atomic scale using nanoparticles. So I ask you, what force would Newton infer from observing these kinds of colloidal crystals, right? If you just showed him the colloidal crystal of gold nanoparticles forming this clathrate, well, he probably would say, well, there must be something holding them together. There's something attracting the particles to one another, and somehow that's holding them together. Of course, whatever is that attractive force is on a larger time scale, larger length scale, larger energy scale than we're talking about at the atomic scale. But DNA linkers, you don't have to use DNA. You could just functionalize with short oligomers, small molecule ligands that have van der Waals interactions with each other. You can use proteins and protein antibody pairs as linkers. There are many different kinds of molecules that or molecular structures that you can use grafted onto the surfaces of nanoparticles of all kinds of different materials and all kinds of different shapes to get those nanoparticles to self-assemble into structures that they ordinarily might not want to self-assemble into, because you have engineered interactions between these nanoparticles. And so here's just some examples and the labs, the PIs of the labs that they come from of the really extraordinary diversity of colloidal crystals that are possible today. And some of these structures are just really amazing, like making nano frames. So it's like a nanoparticle, but empty on the inside. It's just the frame, and those can self-assemble into larger crystal structures. Or you can use, this is again with complementary DNA. Chris Murray's group at Penn and Dmitry Talapin at University of Chicago. They make different kinds of particles. They typically work with rare earths, and they'll make nanoplates that are typically maybe 10, 20, 30 nanometers, and they functionalize them with ligands. Now they're starting to use dendrimers to even further control the effective shapes of these things. And by doing that, you can get a lot of different kind of interesting structures, including quasicrystals, which I'll show you, talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. These are some interesting structures where if you take spheres or other kinds of particles and you decorate different parts of the particles with differently so that the interactions are now directional, you can create valence in a different way. And you can get very interesting kinds of structures. Where am I? Here, like these open structures here. So there's just a huge amount of complexity, structural complexity possible through the self-assembly of nanoparticles. And these colloidal crystals are often isostructural to known atomic crystals. And for that reason, we often refer to nanoparticles as the colloidal analog of atoms. So let me show you, I want to show you this movie. I have to remember how to do it. I have to get the little thingy. No, hold on one second. There it is. I just have to put the little hand there. Nope, I'm not seeing a hand. I have to left click. Okay, here's a movie. I'll play it again afterwards. This is a Monte Carlo simulation of a box of tetrahedrally shaped nanoparticles. They're actually tetrahedra where we've truncated a little the corners and the edges, right? So it's like a little bit shaved. And the simulation started out where it was all fuzzy blue. That means that all of the particles in the system are just randomly arranged and you have a fluid phase. Let me try to play that again. Play. Left click. Boom. And then you see that we color them orange when locally they seem to be in some kind of organized structure, but it's definitely not a long-range structure. There's no long-range order in the system. Red are the ones that are at the end going to be in the crystal phase, right? So we can run it to the end, figure out what crystal it is, and then watch for when a particle is locally going to be part of the final crystal and color it red. So we can actually see the crystallization process. Okay, so this is a complicated crystal structure. It turns out that there's 432 particles in this unit cell, and it's isostructural to something called the Bergman phase that was found by Linus Pauling a long time ago. And the interesting thing about this simulation is that there are no interactions between the particles. There's no bonding elements. There's no potential energy in the system. There's no forces between the particles. The only rule is that the particles can't overlap. They are billiard balls exhibiting Brownian motion in a box. The box has periodic boundary conditions, but you can see here that it forms something where you have a coexistence of this really complicated crystal and a fluid phase. Okay, but there's no interactions. So the reason, so there's no energy. The only thing you have in this system is entropy. So this system went from a disordered state to an ordered state, and there's nothing in the system but entropy. So what would Newton say about that if he looked at that crystal forming, right? If I showed you that movie and I didn't mention that there weren't attractive interactions, you'd probably think there were attractive interactions between them. Otherwise, how else would they come together like that? So that's what we're going to spend our time talking about. It turns out that we have known that entropy can order systems for a very long time. Since the time of Onsager in 1949, Onsager said if you take infinitely long, infinitely thin rods and pack them together and keep increasing the packing fraction, at some point they're going to have to line up. They will give up rotational degrees of freedom to gain translational degrees of freedom in order to maximize the entropy in the system. And so this simulation here, okay, they're not infinitely long, but they are hard particles with an aspect ratio of about 5:1, and we color them green as soon as they start to align with one another. And so there's no interaction between these particles, and the system goes from an isotropic phase to a nematic phase. This is the isotropic nematic transition of liquid crystals. This is one of hard rods. And the reason that the system does this is because if there's no potential energy in the system, and you just have entropy in the system. So these simulations are at constant number of particles, constant volume, constant temperature. So the free energy, the relevant free energy, relevant thermodynamic potential for the system is Helmholtz potential, which is the potential energy minus T times the entropy. So without potential energy, you only have entropy. So minimizing the free energy means maximizing the entropy. And the system maximizes the entropy by organizing itself, because there are more ways to arrange these rods if they align than if they don't align, right? At some point, if they don't align, then you're going to run out, they're just going to bump into each other, they can't overlap, and you're done. But if they line up, there's many more ways of arranging them. So many more ways of arranging things, that's the entropy. So this was probably the first example of an entropy-driven ordering process. Some years later, like less than a decade later, Kirkwood, a chemist, said, I bet that this is true for spheres also. And people said, spheres? Okay, I understand the rods, there's rotational, like they line up. But spheres, why would spheres do this? And so his students, Bernie Alder and Wainwright, and then Robert Wood and Jacobson, Alder and Wainwright did what is really the first molecular dynamic simulation of just hard particles before Raman. And Wood and Jacobson did a Monte Carlo simulation, basically the same exact thing that I've been showing you. And they just start with, it took them a year on a Cray at the time, which is cool, for 500 particles. So here is a bunch of spheres at a packing fraction or particle volume fraction of about 52%. Green means that locally it's organized with its neighbors. It's in some kind of local ordered state, configuration. And so we see that the crystal starts someplace and then it grows and it takes over the system, and it turns out that this is a face-centered cubic crystal. There are no interactions between these particles. They're just billiard balls. And in fact, the way that I understand it when I go to these liquid Gordon conferences on the physics of liquids, that this was something that was argued over for a long time, that entropy could possibly order hard spherical particles, and that the definitive experiment, of course there were simulations, but people were like, they're just simulations. They're not real. We don't believe that. And so this team here, led by Bill Russell and Paul Chaikin at Princeton, and 1997, their experiment got to fly on the space shuttle, and so the crew of the space shuttle that did these experiments for them are authors on the paper. And this is a picture of this tube of toluene with polymethyl methacrylate particles inside that are density matched so that they float, and the index of refraction of the particles and the solvent are also matched so that it screens out all the van der Waals interactions. And they did it, they wanted to get to microgravity, so this was like the best you could do, is to put it on the space shuttle to show there's no gravitational effects, and it really does form a crystal, which you can see from all these beautiful colors. So that was sort of the definitive experiment that said without any explicit attraction, you can get ordering to occur. And so it's very simple. It's just based on this fundamental tenet of thermodynamics that systems evolve to the most probable state, and that microstates that have the same energy are equally probable. It's like the first thing you learn in statistical thermodynamics. And so again, if we are minimizing, say, the Helmholtz free energy and there's no potential energy, then you only have temperature times the entropy. And the entropy is just the Boltzmann's constant times the log of the number of ways of arranging all of these particles in the system. And so minimizing free energy is maximizing entropy, which means maximizing the number of options. So that's how I like to think of entropy. It's just options. The more options, the higher the entropy. So Don Frankel wrote a beautiful paper on this that we were talking about this morning, where he said it, he said it this beautiful way, that you get order through disorder. So the entropy is driving disorder, meaning that you know less about the system, but it's ordered in the sense of positionally ordered. In the colloquial sense of the term, it went from a liquid to a crystal. We would call that ordering. But there are more ways of arranging the particles when they're in a crystal, and so that's where the disorder is. Okay, so my group started studying this problem not because we're studying entropy or anything like that. We were trying to understand nanoparticle assembly with some of the experimentalists we were working with. And my student, Amir, who's assistant professor now in chemical engineering at Yale, we told him, could you throw some tetrahedral particles in a box? We were trying to simulate cad telluride nanoparticles functionalized with DMAET ligands in water. And there's all kinds of interactions. There's van der Waals interactions, there's charge, so you have electrostatics, and it's messy. And we were trying to understand why our collaborator, Nick Kotoff, and his students would sometimes find that those cad telluride nanoparticles self-assembled into, which are like a nanometer and a half across, would sometimes self-assemble into sheets, and sometimes into long chains, and sometimes into ribbons, and sometimes into twisted ribbons. So we're trying to find one model that could explain all of these different phases. And we didn't know which forces were more important than other forces for all of these different structures. So at some point, I asked Amir, turn off all the forces. Let's just first look at what happens when we just have hard particles, and then we'll turn on every force one by one. So your only job right now is to just thermally randomize everything. And he came back with a structure that I'm like, that's not random. Well, I thought you turned off all the forces. He said, I did. Clearly you did not. So we went back and did it again. And eventually, this is the structure that we figured out that he found. So this is a dodecagonal quasicrystal. So it's got 12-fold rotational order. If you look at it from the, this is from along the 12-fold axis of rotation, and then this is from the side. Dodecagonal quasicrystals are an example of an axial quasicrystal, which means they are quasicrystalline in 2D, but then the third axis is periodic. And so this is the periodic axis here. And you see that what the arrangement of these tetrahedra are 5 of them make one of these yellow pentagonal dipyramids, and then there's 12 that make a 12-member ring, and then there's a dipyramid, and then there's a ring, and then there's a dipyramid. And I will note that if you have a 12-member ring and you put, sorry, if you have a 10-member ring and you put a pentagonal dipyramid in there and one at the bottom, it'll make a very nice icosahedron that doesn't fill space, but it's awfully close. But that's not what they do. They have 12 particles in the ring, so there's a lot more wiggle room in there. And so they make these, and then the columns line up, and they, you get this thing, and then so this is what this is what it looks like, and this is what the diffraction pattern looks like. This is actually from a much larger system that we did, so we can see what this looks like. And you can see, if you look at the diffraction pattern, that you have 12 peaks, 12 spots all the way around. Now, a quasicrystal quasicrystals were discovered in the lab at NIST. Of course, long before I was there or Rob was there, and probably most of you were there. And they are crystals that were originally, that have forbidden symmetries if a crystal is periodic. And it was thought that before quasicrystals that you couldn't have a crystal, meaning you couldn't have Bragg peaks if you didn't have periodicity. Quasicrystals don't have translational periodicity, but they have long-range order. It's just a different kind, right? So it's like orientational order. This is a picture of Dan Sheckman, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2011 for his discovery of this at NIST. This is a picture of his green NIST lab book. Do you still have your green NIST lab books? Right? I still have. Do you have some? We all have green NIST lab books. So this is when he did these experiments. He's writing down he's indexing all of these peaks, and he was looking at a metal alloy that had 10-fold rotational symmetry, and you can see he wrote 10-fold, question mark, question mark. And that right there is the amazing, incomparable John Kahn, who was, this is Dan Sheckman here, and this is the group that worked on this project and found this structure and showed that you could actually have these kinds of crystal structures, which the International Union of Crystallography, I forgot exactly the name, changed the definition of a crystal once we realized that you could actually have these quasicrystals. The quasicrystal that Amir found, this dodecagonal quasicrystal, this particular one turns out to be isostructural to a tantalum-tellurium quasicrystal chalcogenide that had been reported in 1998, I think. Yeah, in 1998. So this is a electron microscopy image of the system of all the atoms. This is a 5 nanometer scale bar. This is the scattering pattern. And one of the ways you can see if you have a quasicrystal is you draw these tiling patterns on top, and it helps you figure out what kind of crystal you have. And you could see that there's this layer that you could take out of this particular quasicrystal where you could kind of see these 12-member rings of atoms. Of course, it's different because they're atoms, they're not solid particles. But if you were to compare the diffraction patterns, they're identical. So if you're so I should say, if you scatter off of the centers, the centroids of the tetrahedra, then you get the identical patterns. Okay, so here's a Monte Carlo simulation, but done by, that's Amir at the top. This one is done by Kwong later, just to show you how this forms. And again, the box has like 53% of the box is full of particles, and the rest is just empty. And we just don't show the particles when it's random and disordered, so we could see how the crystal emerges. You can see how this thing grows, and at the end you get a quasicrystal in coexistence with a fluid phase. If you change the shape, you change the crystal structure. So if we start truncating the tips of these tetrahedra, then at some point, instead of the quasicrystal, you can get diamond. And if you keep truncating more, then you get a phase that's isostructural to a high-pressure lithium phase, which has 16 particles in the unit cell. And if you truncate the corners of a tetrahedron enough, eventually you get a perfect octahedron. And then that self-assembles into a body-centered cubic crystal. And this picture that I show behind me is a picture from Stefano Saccana's group at NYU Chemistry, where he made this truncated tetrahedron, I think again out of polymethyl methacrylate, PMMA, which is really hard to do on a micron scale. So it turns out that all of these beautiful nanoparticles that grow as polyhedra, they're growing as little crystals in solution, and that's why you get these beautiful faceted little particles. But on this small scale of a couple hundred nanometers or below, it's really hard to screen out all of the interactions between the particles to really get a hard particle system. At this larger scale of microns, where you use plastic to get your particles, so like polystyrene or PMMA, or you could also use silica, then it's possible to screen out all the interactions, but it's really hard to make shapes that aren't spheres or ellipsoids. And so this was actually a big achievement for his group to make these truncated tetrahedra. And here is an image from confocal microscopy showing that they self-assemble into this diamond structure that we had predicted in our simulations. We have studied tens of thousands of shapes, more than tens of thousands of shapes now, just with tiny little changes to see like how much can you change a shape and get different kinds of crystal structures. And so this was the first study after Amir, where the computers got fast enough between 2009 when we published Amir's paper and 2012 when we published this paper, that now my student Pablo could do exactly what Amir did, but he could do it for 150 shapes simultaneously. And so he picked all these different shapes by going to Mathematica and just going, I'm going to take those first 150 shapes. And 101 of them crystallized into all kinds of different crystal structures. So all of these over here, well, let me start here. These over here formed liquid crystals, discotic liquid crystals, or pneumatic liquid crystals like that, like the rods I showed you, or smectic liquid crystals. And then here's a bunch of them that made, you can get all of the different Bravais lattices. Here's the tetrahedron that forms a quasicrystal. It turns out if you glue two tetrahedra together and throw them in a box and do a simulation, then they also form a quasicrystal, the same quasicrystal. But these over here form crystals in a way that the particles are spinning, sometimes complete rotational invariance, sometimes there's preferred directions. So we call them plastic crystals. Most of them, when they're very roundy, form FCC crystals, which you would expect from something that's round. But there's some shapes here that don't look like rhombic dodecahedra, which is the Voronoi shape of FCC, and they're not round, but yet they form FCC, and you'd be hard-pressed to guess what crystal structures, if I just showed you any of these shapes, you'd be hard-pressed to guess what crystal structure is it going to form. But that's what we would like to be able to do. These over here are examples of shapes that just didn't order on the time scale of the publication. But many of them have been running since 2012. Like, we just keep starting them and running them, and half of them now have ordered. So it's just kinetics. It's just a kinetic issue. Some of them still haven't, which is interesting on its own. But anyway, so this is one of my personal favorite ones. This is a pentagonal bipyramid. So this is what it looks like from the side, and this is what it looks like from above. And I'm looking, this is the top view and the side view. When the particles are colored blue, then it's in the original fluid phase. And when they're yellow, they're in a high density fluid phase with no long range order. And when they're green, they're part of the final crystal. So let me show this movie again. Way. So I find this astonishing that this crystal grows, like, look at how it's growing. It's like following, right? It's following this pattern. This is how this, I mean, clearly this isn't simple classical nucleation theory. There's some kind of fluid-fluid transition that's preceding crystallization. The crystallization process is, I don't know exactly how to describe it. This is what the final crystal, this is what the final unit cell looks like. It has 244 particles in the unit cell. Okay, again, no interactions, entropy, just entropy maximization. Again, like, you know, what would Newton think if he saw this, right? Like, there must be some attractive interactions in this system. This is a cool one by my student Sang-Min Lee, a chemical engineering student. Here, he is studying this particular shape right here. And it's just one kind of shape. And he's just doing Monte Carlo simulations, Brownian motion. And once it gets dense enough, it forms this structure. So this is what the particles look like. But if we did it all like that, you can't really see what the structure is. So instead, he draws it this way, where he draws this cage. And then you can see that it really is this clathrate network. It's got 92 particles in the unit cell. It's a guest-host structure where the guests are the hosts. It's the same particles, right? The system is forming this clathrate structure and then sequestering inside one of its own. And the reason that it does that, you can see here, you can see that the whole cage structure, the host structure, is basically locked up, very little entropy. It's dumped all its entropy into those guests that are spinning around like crazy. If you don't let them spin, this structure falls apart. If you take them out, the host crystal spits in one of its own to put back, you know, to give a particle up to give the system entropy, to stabilize, to minimize the free energy of the system. So this is just like amazing. So, you know, it's a kind of entropic partitioning or entropic compartmentalization that the system like has sacrificed part of itself, right? And then the rest of it is able to stabilize it. So the thing that we learn from all of these simulations that I showed you that goes beyond, you know, what we maybe learned from Onsager or from the hard sphere simulations is that, you know, we know you can have effective, you know, that you have statistical entropic forces. We've known that for a long time, and they come up in all kinds of different situations. What we understand now is that these emergent statistical entropic forces can be directional. And that directionality can produce a valence that gives you these different crystal structures. And these directional entropic forces are related to the way in which the system distributes local free volume in the system. So for example, if I just took two particles in a box, and I look here, I'm sorry, I keep walking back and forth. This is, so green means free volume in the system. The free volume is all the space that's available for you to put the particle in. and you have to put like the whole center of the particle in. So all this available space to you, if I wanted to put another particle in the system, that's the free volume. If two particles are not particularly aligned well, they're going to take up a lot of space that another particle can't fit into. That leaves less free volume for the rest of the system. If they align like these cubes and come closer together, then they give more free volume to the rest of the system. More free volume means more places for the other particles to go. And more places for the other particles to go means more entropy in the system. And so maximization of entropy is basically maximizing the free volume available in the system. So now we come to this discussion about bonding, right? So the idea that you can get the same complexity and diversity of structure with no interactions whatsoever, just from hard shapes, as you can from atoms, is surprising to me, at least. That you can, you have chemical bonding and entropic bonding. But what it tells you is that statistical thermodynamics doesn't care about the origin of the forces. It just cares that your system is thermodynamic, it's ergodic, it can, in principle, explore all of its possible microstates of the system. But beyond that, it doesn't care where the forces come from. They come from quantum mechanics or they come from something else. That could be the only explanation for why you can get exactly the same crazy complicated structures in these very different ways. So I would argue that if that's true, then we should be able to develop ab initio methods to predict crystal structures from a knowledge of the shape in the same way that we can predict crystal structures from atoms using quantum mechanical codes like electronic structure codes and density functional theory codes, right? We have those kinds of codes. We have those equations. But the reason we could do that is because for atoms is we have Schrodinger's equation, this beautiful eigenvalue equation. So when we're solving electronic structure methods, if you have some atoms and you say, I want to know what's the say the ground state, the best lowest energy crystal structure of a bunch of atoms, then you put them on the points on the nodes of the lattice that you want to check, and then you let me see what I have on here. Right. So, and then you're solving Schrodinger's equation or the Kohn-Sham equations or some approximation using these iterative matrix methods. You're solving them for the, you're trying to optimize the electron density in the system. That's what gives you the minimum free energy in the system. So that's what I want to be able to do for entropy. And so I have this brilliant postdoc, Thibault, who's looking for a faculty position starting this year, and he's a chemical engineer, but really he's a theoretician. And so I put this to him, right? Because here was the problem. I didn't know how to, I thought we need an eigenvalue. There should be an eigenvalue equation. We need to get an eigenvalue equation. Where are we going to get that from? I don't know how to describe the volume. So we said, well, I think what we want to do, we could work with free volume, but it's actually easier to think about this in terms of excluded volume. An excluded volume is all of that, if two particles are arranged in a certain way, whatever you can't access that isn't free volume is excluded volume. So the goal is to minimize the excluded volume. But I didn't know how to count it. Like what is the thing that I'm writing an equation for? I wasn't sure, what was the best way to do that. And so T's insight was, well, why don't we just throw in some point particles and count those? So the idea is that we want to be able to have a proxy for the excluded volume in the system that we then want to minimize or maximize free volume. Same thing. The idea is that you set your particles up in some trial crystal structure. You throw in these fictitious pseudoparticles, and you say, these particles, which are just mathematical devices, do not interact with each other. They're ideal. They go right through each other. But they interact with the particles. So particles will now interact with each other through these pseudoparticles that'll have an attractive interaction with the nanoparticles. So the idea is to replace these effective entropic forces with actual attractive forces that we can then quantify, right? So that's the idea, is to transform these implicit interactions to explicit interactions. And so basically, so I won't go through all this, of course, but for the experts, we take these pseudoparticles and we just derive a mean field effective interaction between the pseudoparticles and the nanoparticles. And then we just need a governing equation for the local pseudoparticle density in the system. And we get that by writing down a convection diffusion equation. And if you just take your mean field effective energy expression, you put it in the convection diffusion equation, and then you'll get an eigenvalue equation, which we can then solve. And so this is what the mean field interaction energy looks like. And mean field just means I'm in my system, I'm sitting on a particle, and I'm in the proxy system where I've thrown in all these pseudoparticles, which are counting up the volume, the local excluded volume for me. And I'm going to figure out the average interaction from all the other particles in the system and all of the pseudoparticles in the system. And then you get this interaction potential U sub m in terms of these things. This is the density of pseudoparticles in the system as a function of position in the system. And that is what you end up calculating is the chemical potential of those fictitious pseudoparticles. And so if you plot for increasing chemical potential, what this mean field interaction looks like, it gets deeper, it's attractive at some point, and it gets deeper and deeper, which is how you would think about chemical. If the chemical potential is high, it should be harder to put a new pseudoparticle in the system. It should be harder to push them together, okay? Then we can write down a convection diffusion equation for the probability density, the local density of pseudoparticles in the system. And so this is your standard convection diffusion equation, where here we have the interaction between the particles and the pseudoparticles. And then you just do a separation of variables. You plug in the expression for UM, and you take the steady state limit, and out pops this expression, which is a beautiful eigenvalue equation. Now that means that we can use the same iterative matrix methods that are used to solve these density functional theory problems, electronic structure theory. We can use all of that machinery here to solve this. So the way you do it for, by the way, someone needs to tell me when I should stop talking, because I don't know, like when, really soon, right? Okay, and this is a 2-hour, no, I'm kidding. Okay, so I'll try to finish up, just give me like 2 or 3 minutes. So when you're solving, when you want to solve Schrodinger's equation for the energy of a particular crystal structure of atoms, right? You have to try different crystal structures. You have to guess the crystal structures, try them, or you try something and you move them around, and the whole goal is to find the lowest energy. So you take your atoms and you set them on the points of the lattice, but you can't deal with the whole atom. So you instead put the electron cloud that's associated, like the valence electrons, that's associated with the atoms. But still, that's very complicated. So you expand your electron density in terms of spherical harmonics. And then that's still a lot. So you take, so these are what the atomic orbitals, which map to these spherical harmonics. You say, well, I'll take like the lowest order ones, and I'll take more when I need them. But I'll put like the lowest order spherical harmonics or atomic orbitals, and I'll put those on there. And then my goal is to find a bonding orbital whose energy I minimize. And you do that by doing what's called a linear combination of atomic orbitals. So you write a wave function as a linear combination of these different orbitals on all of these lattice sites. And the whole goal is to maximize the electronic overlap that minimizes the energy of the system. So that's what we're going to do too. So we take our confined system of shapes, we replace it, we throw in these pseudoparticles that now will give us this eigenvalue equation. And then T said, well, okay, we can't use spherical harmonics, obviously, so let's write shape harmonics, because we want to do this with the geometry of whatever shape we're doing. So we can make these shape orbitals. So this is what the lowest order, next order, next highest order shape orbitals look like for a cube. And those are the shape orbitals that we will use to do an expansion of our local pseudoparticle density in the system. And then we just write down this trial wave function, just like you would do in solving a density functional theory problem. And then you just iterate until you've converged on the set of coefficients, and that's your wave function. And whatever comes out, the energy is the eigenvalue. The eigenvalue is the energy. And then you do that again for a different crystal structure, whoever has the lowest energy wins. So here's what the lowest order shape orbitals and bonding orbitals look like for cubes, for tetrahedra, for dodecahedra, and for hexagonal prisms. This is the energy that you get from this calculation of two particles in a sea of other particles in the system at some volume fraction. It's maybe 50-something% packing fraction. So this would be the lowest energy bonding orbital of a cube dimer, or of a tetrahedron dimer, or a hexagonal prism dimer, or dodecahedron dimer. This is what I mean when I say entropic bond. It's not a bond like a chemical bond, because there's no electrons, but mathematically, we can write the entropy in a way that we use familiar terms from chemical bonding. So just to show you that this works, for example, you can ask what lattice is preferred for hard cubes at a density of 55%. You can set up different crystal structures like simple cubic, or face-centered cubic, or body-centered cubic, and then put those in the machinery, crank it out, get the energy, plot it here, and the simple cubic one has the lowest energy. That's the one we would have guessed. Simple cubic arrangement of cubes is probably the best way to arrange them to maximize the entropy. Okay, so that works. I showed you all of these shapes before. Now we throw those shapes in there. So we can ask which lattice is preferred for hard truncated tetrahedra at a density of 55%. And so here we want to look at it as a function of truncation. So this axis shows the amount of truncation. So this is no truncation. It's a perfect quasicrystal, but we can't do this with a quasicrystal, so you have to use an approximate. Quasicrystal approximate with 82 particles in the unit cell. But this is the one that should win, the quasicrystal should win when there's zero truncation, and in fact, that's the one with the lowest energy. Then we keep truncating, the shape is changing, but still the quasicrystal wins until this point here, and now the diamond structure wins. That has the lowest energy. And then we keep going, and it switches and switches and switches, and you go from one crystal structure to another, and the places where they switch are these colors. So this is the quasicrystal, and then it becomes diamond, and then it comes beta tin, and then it becomes BCC. These black lines are the results of Monte Carlo simulations that we published many years ago. And it matches up really well. So I will close with this, if I may be so bold as to say, there's some analogies we can make here that we can, if we compare chemical bonding with entropic bonding, that, you know, if we compare, like, the nucleus is the hard shape, the electrons are represented here by pseudoparticles, except that electrons actually interact with each other. These pseudoparticles don't, because they're fictitious and they're just counting devices for the excluded volume. So there's no electron-electron interactions. The orbitals are atomic orbitals or shape orbitals. Instead of orbital hybridization, right, this doesn't make sense in this context, but it is orbital overlap in this case. And the governing equation for both is an eigenvalue equation for the density of the objects that are mediating the interactions with the things, between the things that you're interested in, which in one case is atoms, and in the other cases is these hard particles. So I will, oh, that is not at all the thing I want to do. So, so I will leave you with that, and thank you for letting me go a little bit over, and I'll just list the takeaways here that we have for the first time, I think, a predictive theory of entropic bonding that allows us to take shapes and then try different trilattices and figure out which one is the best one. Of course, many of these structures I showed you, they have really big lattices, and I'd have to guess them to know to try them. And then the more complicated they are, the harder that calculation is, the iterative matrix calculation is. So it's not clear that it's completely practical, but I think it's interesting that you can, in principle, at least do it. And if nothing else, maybe we can learn something about the nature of bonding in matter by comparing these very different kinds of situations. So I'll close with this beautiful picture of the group in front of the beautiful changing leaves, and say thank you very much for having me.